Phase of our meeting, I want to turn to two researchers who have not only worked on rape as an academic issue, but have taught courses specifically on rape. Because I believe very firmly that part of addressing the problem of rape on campuses is incorporating this as a theme into our education of students, whatever our discipline is. The more we talk about it, the more self-conscious about it people will be. And the whole idea that this is too sensitive an issue to talk about because some people may find it traumatic or disturbing, really, I think, is terribly patronizing and infantilizing to our students and does them a real disservice. So we've got a couple of people whom I regard as paradigmatic scholars in this regard, and Maria-Belén Ordóñez from Ontario College of Art and Design is one of them. Her field is anthropology, but she again is someone who does social science much more broadly and works on all kinds of issues of gender politics, ethnography, and sexual communities within the urban environment. And she is going to be talking to us about a paradigmatic case that she has used as an exemplum in her pedagogical interaction with students, the famous, or I should rather say infamous case of the French politician Dominique Strauss-Khan. So Maria-Belén, I look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay?
Can we speak up a little more?
So thanks for sticking it out all the way until this late hour, even though we're so bright and sunny out there. I'm going to come at this sideways, if I can, and I'd like to sort of pause to sort of think about what we've been talking about today and to sort of contextualize some of those conversations and how we can possibly take those conversations into a theoretically based dialogue in the classroom. So I'm kind of taking it away from the campus a little bit. I'm even taking it away from some of the sort of more policy-generated discussions to think about some of the theory that can potentially create really kind of more rigorous attempts to engage with issues of consent. So I'm going to read, and by the way, I have my email here because I know if you're anything like me, I sort of think about questions after, maybe the next day. So if you think about questions the next day, and this is actually an ongoing piece that I'm working on here, so I would love to get your feedback and your criticism as well. So, social endeavors to contain the messy traces of unmediated desire in the public sphere often fails because once there is a media undoing, it is like a loose thread that is begging to be pulled, and there's very little that can halt a public's craving to know, to observe, to judge, to moralize, and to organize emergent nodes of power. The moral appropriateness and behavior of some public figures does not only adhere, at least on the surface, to an elusive bourgeois morality and a capitalist system, there is also a public's keen fascination and desire to witness the moral transgressions of those in power. This paper is a version of a chapter in an edited book by Pavan Kumar, Bert Heidemann, Ole Ollerson, and Janet Wilson entitled Reworking Postcolonialism, Globalization, Labor, and Rights, published in 2015. And my chapter is a result of media research I conducted in 2011-2012 about the public undoing of Dominique Strauss-Khan, the former leader of the International Monetary Fund. Nafissatou Diallo, the Guinean-born claimant, charged DSK with sexual assault after first encountering him at the Sofitel New York hotel while she was working there as a chambermaid. She accepted an out-of-court financial settlement in December 2012, approximately a year and a half after initial charges were laid. My original research focused on feminist reverberations and cultural impacts from the sexual assault charges against DSK. And my most current interest has been to revisit these reverberations with students in a feminist theory course at Ontario College of Art and Design University in Toronto. My intention was to inspire a dialogue that veered away from simple notions of consent, too often and too neatly packaged as clear affirmations of either yes or no, with little space or language that could account for the disorganization of life. To this end, course readings underscored the value of contention, failure, vulnerability, oppositional consciousness, tactics, mestiza border crossings, attachments and refusals, counterintuitive feminisms, and queer temporalities. In addition to the elusive, generative, contradictory, and unpredictable aspects of relationships that are formed and just as easily and as quickly dismantled. Part of the critical work of the class was to rearrange and reconfigure existing tropes and representations of victimization. Diallo, appearing vindicated here at a Bronx courthouse to finalize the terms of settlement with DSK, interrupted media representations of powerlessness, often associated with racialized, classed, and gendered bodies. This photograph, taken by Seth Winning, captures Diallo poised, seated, and surrounded by men in suits who stand around her and visually frame the scene as floating signifiers of masculinity. In this instance, Diallo's posture is one of confidence and determination. This image was discussed in class so as to trouble the idea that Diallo lived in the media's shadow. Students made links between her racialized female body and a European history of colonization that includes the racialization of sexual violence and the geopolitics of power in and in between New York, Paris, and Guinea. Diallo, nonetheless, made herself available to the media, inscribing her words and image as evocations to act. The media's scrutiny of Diallo and DSK's encounter underscored this post-colonial history, thus adding to messy representations of power. Images such as these offered something other than a narrative, something other than the need to assess Diallo's consent as evidence. It was, as some students explained, a visual representation of a woman's intelligent resourcefulness and resignation, and not an image of victimhood. Rather than presenting the out-of-court settlement as a failure of justice, Diallo's pose in the courtroom is what initiated a dialogue about consent. It was a conversation that converged with the local media narrative of sexual assault, which unfolded closer to home. During our discussions this past February, Jian Ghomeshi, a once celebrated public radio host for the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, was on trial for 7 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of overcoming resistance by choking against 6 women. This media backdrop further informed the nuances of consent, and Ghomeshi's not guilty verdict pointed to the bluntness of the law as an ineffective tool in evaluating the contradictions and temporalities of consent. Similar to the DSK case, the Ghomeshi trial to some extent demonstrated how the contexts of sexual consent are not static, nor are they plainly contractual. Contrary to popular films like 50 Shades of Grey, which students referenced as an example of a straightforward contract, these cases exemplified how consent moves and shifts from one unpredictable moment to the next. When a couple of the claimants in Ghomeshi's trial were accused of lying in court about their contact with Ghomeshi after he had assaulted them, students were asked to consider the blurry and sometimes disorienting categories of pleasure and violence in sexual relationships, as much as considering what the aftershocks of sexual violence might look like. For example, there was speculation that when Diallo first approached DSK to clean his hotel room, she initially agreed to have sex with him, only to be entrapped in an escalation of violence that she had not anticipated or expected. These cases, like many cases, do not conveniently fall into an order that turns women into ideal victims with coherent narratives of sexual assault. Students paid attention to the strength of these women as public figures whose lives were being scrutinized within a patriarchal system that construed their actions and inactions as simultaneously vulnerable and manipulative, in need of protection as much as in need of shaming and exposure. The course widened the scope of what agency might look like, and students were able to appreciate that not all terms of agency are manifested in the same way, nor should they be. One student noted that, and I quote the student here, "Liberal feminism is hegemonic in nature, wherein it is assumed that all women want the same thing, and there is only one way to achieving said goal." End of quote. As a class, we made room for uncertainty as an important element of consent, although some students insisted that uncertainty seems to be reserved for sexual assault more so than for other violent situations. For example, one student suggested that being robbed or randomly attacked is not as ambiguous because sex is not a factor, nor is there a relationship. While there may be evidence of violence in sexual assault cases, such as bruising, and in the case of Diallo, a dislocated shoulder, it's ultimately the complicatedness of sex that raised the most difficult questions for students. Diallo's charges against DSK encountered a number of obstacles when it was discovered that she had lied on her asylum application, but there was little question as to the circumstances that would have forced someone to lie on a colonial form of the empire's making. In contrast to this, DSK's bourgeois entitlement was most poignantly observed when the French philosopher Bernard Henry Lévy spoke out against DSK's arrest and treatment because he believed that the legal system had dared to treat DSK like any other person. Everybody, declared the philosopher, is not everybody. There is perhaps an unintended truth-telling in this statement, even though Lévy was not referring to how privilege can and does produce injustices for everybody else. Students recognized the blatant inequality between DSK and Diallo, as they also became frustrated with the direction of the Ghomeshi trial because allowances weren't being made for women whose experiences of sexual violence could not easily be articulated, recounted, or made to fit into a linear logic. This apparent incoherence, students noted, was evident when Diallo had been expected to react in a particular way, immediately following the assault in DSK's hotel room. Diallo publicly denounced and sued the New York Post for libel after they had published headline stories claiming that in addition to working as a chambermaid, Diallo made money as a sex worker. This deliberate framing of clandestine work diverts attention away from charges of rape and suggests instead that sex between Diallo and DSK was irrefutably consensual. The world of hookers is stripped of any glamour since working on the side is an all too familiar reality for most Americans who struggle to make a living wage. Nevertheless, the description that dominates is one that invites moral judgments regarding transactions of sex and money while simultaneously sustaining fantasies of DSK's libertinage. These contrasts created media stories that moved between inconsistent characterizations of moral villains and heroes as if lives weren't lived somewhere in between. Living in between, like research and teaching that starts in the middle, was framed with specific methodologies in mind. So the interest to follow the case of DSK contributes to an archive that tracks injustices along class, gender, and race. However, media wasn't collected for the purpose of creating a feminist archive that addresses sexual assault in a patriarchal global order, although many aspects of the story lends itself to that kind of research. Instead, affect, in the context of my own media explorations, explicitly highlights the element of unpredictability has an immediate impact on social life. In other terms, it's not just a matter of accumulating examples that focus on creating an archive, but more significantly, that those moments of impact do not reconstitute or re-territorialize for the purpose of making sense. Affect is a methodological imperative that destabilizes the subject prerogative to put into order unexplainable feelings and relations. Thus, the class moved with, against, and around the margins in an effort to feel the contradictions, but not to set them straight. Rupturing the linearity of media representations and the ethnographic original tears apart the specter of root systems. The production of what may be called an ethnographic moment is just that, a moment, a flash, a point of departure into another moment. Ethnographic text, therefore, is productive when it becomes like a little machine that can connect to other machines or assemblages, such as other subjects at a different time and place, like with students at OCAD U, for example. This is effectively like a rhizome, scattered intensities that pulse and get caught up in the rhythm of life. Sensing rhizomes and tracking their emergence has various speeds of contact that I do not purport to pin down, because the speed in which life happens leaves designations of public and private blurry. Deterritorialization constructs the subject as a changing entity, and what was once an acknowledged multiple identity becomes alternatively an unpredictable becoming, as in Diallo's vindication or as in DSK's political unraveling, both caught in peculiar representations of self. This is also true of students' engagement with my research of DSK and Diallo, which stressed the importance of partial and situated knowledges, which one student suggested challenges prescriptive reactions. When I asked what she meant by this, she elaborated upon the need to evaluate activism that was propelled by sexual assault cases, in particular the impacts and resonance that activism has on specific locations and agents, and the recognition that each inspires complicated and temporal responses. Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari suggest that it is not subjectivity in and of itself that opens up creative possibilities. It is instead that bodies' movements partake in a network of events that shift the question from what does the body represent to what can a body do. If ethnographies of sexual consent are to be experimental, which I actually think they should be, or at least exploratory, what needs consideration are those bodies that become something else in the midst of their unraveling, as opposed to their careful structuring. Contradictions and the instability of narratives are neither clear representations of resistance nor of ideology. They are, in Catherine Stewart's terms, moving targets. I'm expanding this ethnography by including the voices of feminist theory students, not solely to unpack the meaning and specificity of sexual consent, but also as a way to approach the temporality and disorienting mechanisms of consent, which do not exclusively rely on those who are most impacted, but instead on those who actively respond and interpret events. The movement and efforts of others, therefore, forced us to start in the middle. Diallo, for example, pursued justice despite the odds and moral judgments, and in the midst of DSK's political career when he was potentially halfway to becoming the president of France, or in the middle of feminist thought, when marginal perspectives emerged to disrupt claims of universal sisterhood. It was also in the middle of this media scandal that DSK was faced with the literary force of Marcella Yacoub, a woman who creatively unmasked his abject desires in a personalized, partially fictionalized account of their affair. Here, desire gets messy as it spills outside of the expected lines of liberal feminism. Marcella Yacoub's literary work about her affair with DSK entangled him in a different kind of legal battle when he discovered that he was the beast in her novel. Stripped of the glamour associated with libertinage, Yacoub's book Belle et Bête, which was published in 2013, broke the elitist charm that DSK had tried to maintain. Students in the class observed the impact of her book as another unpredictable moment, and if we had had more time, I would have included the partial fiction and full text of Belle et Bête as lively and emergent feminist literature. Counterintuitive feminist thinking, I insist, opens up opportunities to think otherwise, which is key in developing feminist concepts of the here and now. So there's a general disregard for the effective labor of chambermaids who provide services in order to survive. This condescension supports the historical invisibility of women's labor and invokes familiar colonial tropes. Anne Stoller highlights the gendering of colonial relationships, where probably no subject is discussed more than sex in colonial literature and no subject more frequently invoked to foster the racist stereotypes of European society. Jean-François Kahn, a French journalist and close friend of DSK's, for example, described the event as a troussage de domestique, which means to strip or have casual forced sex with a servant, diminishing and purposefully downplaying the physical trace of DSK's violence. DSK, by the way, suffered from a dislocated shoulder. This collapses the coercion of sex desire as an inevitability of gendered, race, and class relations. On May 22, 2011, and in response to sexist comments, hundreds protested at the Pompidou Center in Paris. Groups like La Barbe and Parole de Femme denounced misogynist language and circulated petitions in addition to writing op-ed pieces for print media such as Le Monde. According to La Barbe, it is men who still reside in caves, and it is women's nature that must help them get out. La Barbe's call to pull men out of caves upheld familiar dichotomies that associate the good with the civilized, the bad with the primitive. Taking men out of their caves proclaims an urgent demand to modernize and to discipline men into civility. This message, I think, is of particular importance given France's long colonial history and the role assigned to French women in African and Asian contexts. Stoller points to the complicity of European women wives in advancing racial and class segregation upon arrival to the colonies to ensure racial purity and moral consciousness. Male colonizers positioned European women as the bearers of redefined colonial morality. In addition to being a key component in civilizing missions, redefining morality also meant curtailing concubinage between European men and native women, thus justifying unequal relations that came to normalize the colonial and post-colonial logic of troussage de domestique. La Barbe's concerns are obviously different than that of European women in the early 20th century. However, what resonates are the subtle ways in which tropes of civilization collide with feminists' call to action. In contrast to the protests in Paris, female hotel workers in New York took to the streets, dressed in their hotel uniforms to protest DSK's treatment of Diallo, and also to make visible the markers that represent the material realities faced by working women of color in the service industries. Protests surrounding DSK were multi-directional and not always explicitly oppositional. Collectively wearing chambermaid uniforms on the street in order to shame DSK was tied to a visual urgency to see women's embodied labor by occupying public space. The impossibility of stable feminist narratives was apparent when Marcella Yacoub emerged in the middle of legal proceedings to defend DSK with the publication of Une Société de Voleurs. Her defense of DSK apparently situated her as an ally, and this worked to develop an intimate relationship with him, one that she wrote about during the 6-month tenure of their affair. The result was the controversial book Belle et Bête, which fused fiction and reality in a polemic for the love of pigs. Yacoub does not name DSK in the book and only reveals the identity of the pig in an interview with La Nouvelle Observateur magazine. DSK responded with a failed lawsuit in which she attempted to seize the book before publication. The book is dedicated to Yacoub's musings of the pig, the beast, DSK. Perhaps Yacoub's urge stems from a perverse seduction of power. Nonetheless, Yacoub does not condemn DSK and only critiques his sexual repression. She goes on to explain the perversity embedded in a pig mentality, and when referring to Diallo, she justifies that only a pig would find it normal that an African immigrant would give him a blowjob without anything in return, just to give him pleasure, as I quote, and I quote Yacoub, a humble homage to his power. Contrary to most feminist interpretations of gender inequality, Yacoub jolts not only dominant feminist perspectives, but also DSK's public narrative. In some ways, she forced him to come out of the closet of bourgeois respectability and domesticity. Yacoub's novel develops a consensual play of submission and domination, where negotiating the terms of power appears as a minor feminist literature. Different than La Barbe's protest to take men out of their caves, Yacoub asks the reader to observe the cave and to observe the embodiment of the repressed man-pig. Her engagement with and pursuit of DSK transgresses the constructed boundaries of where feminist ethnographers can traverse, turning on its head the essentialist notion that a feminist could not support or love someone like him. Public protests underscore the tie between economic privilege and violence. At the Cambridge Union Society, DSK was confronted with what Antonio Negri and Michael Hart describe as a multitude, or disruptive force. Students occupied the space that he was offered by the Cambridge Union Society, and they linked through protest the sexual assault charges to his role as a wealthy economist and former head of the IMF, thus complicating the impossible separation of his private and public life. Over 200 Diallo supporters protested and challenged DSK's right to speak. While confrontation with police unfolded outside, DSK introduced his lecture by remarking that the invitation to the Cambridge Union Society had sparked some emotion, which he was sorry for, but hoped that, quote, he would not be held responsible for the noise. DSK's hope to fly under the radar deserves some attention in the face of the heavy security that surrounded him. His separation from the noise creates a peculiar distance that is both a cynical acknowledgement and a disregard for his role in actually being the cause of the noise. In the video recording of his speech, it's impossible to ignore the nervous tension of security guards who show signs of preparedness for any unforeseen circumstance. After Jian Ghomeshi was acquitted of 4 counts of sexual assault and 1 of choking, and by the way, other charges are still pending, there was a solidarity protest for the 6 women who had brought the charges against him. Some students from the feminist theory class joined the organized protest in Toronto, which was aligned with the occupation of police headquarters by Black Lives Matter activists who had camped outside the police station for 12.5 days. Black Lives Matter protesters demanded that an inquiry be conducted for the death of black citizens killed by Toronto police, as well as the elimination of police carding of people of color. Protesters from the Ghomeshi trial walked to the police headquarters and joined Black Lives Matter activists, articulating links between different forms of violence that are tied to the judicial system. No public assembly in response to DSK's charges of sexual assault or Ghomeshi's trial came to represent an intelligible message that can feasibly unite women. This ethnographic experiment to track political mobilization around DSK and Diallo provided something other than a feminist archive that could definitively articulate a resounding strategy against sexual violence. Furthermore, the ethnographic pursuit to include the voices of feminist theory students whose reading of the DSK case was also linked to the Jian Ghomeshi trial in Toronto created a forum that by the end of the course and beyond a feminist theory class presented students with the potential to create their own milieus of engagement, critique, and activism. Or, in Gayatri Spivak's terms in a lecture about situating feminisms, describes as, quote, training the imagination for epistemological performance, end of quote. After all, students were weary of institutional policies that might end up generalizing the complicated terrains of sex, power, and consent. The DSK case demonstrated that across cultural boundaries, Diallo supporters rapidly divulged a circuitry of mobilizing affects and media entanglements. For some students, the experience of being in solidarity with Black Lives Matter activists, as much as with the women from the Ghomeshi trial, resonated with the various multi-sided actions that they had read about in regards to DSK and Diallo. The task of tracking media was not simply to point to its obvious hegemonic investment, but rather to pay closer attention to how predictable flows of information are ruptured. These rhizomatic breaks include exploring the middle without needing to resolve contradictions. The public gathering of chambermaids in New York was one example that generated compelling images of women's work. In Paris, Labarbe's commitment to expose male chauvinism by parodying masculinity unintentionally evoked civilizing tropes whereby the burden of women's responsibility was to take men out of their caves. Marcella Yacoub interrupted this burden of responsibility by rejecting any civilizing move. Alternatively, she joined the beast in his cave and relished in an affair that transgressed bourgeois appearance. Perhaps DSK also relished being the subject of the noise generated by Cambridge Union Society students, while also downplaying the impact of his visit in the face of petitions, audible protests, and student arrests. So I returned to Diallo's image in the courtroom on the day that a financial settlement was reached and without DSK in attendance. This visual moment unpacked an ethnographic media analysis that complicated conceptions of power and resistance by following the movements of those involved as well as those in a feminist theory class who responded and engaged with multi-sites of sexual assault. The stillness of Diallo's pose, or what came to be a reflexive moment of aversions and discernments of headless men in suits who appeared and disappeared in a circuitry of power and desire, also became a starting point to engage the tangled and messy pedagogies of consent. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria-Belén. We have time for maybe one question. Laura.
First, a clarification point, then a question. Was it DSK or Diallo with the dislocated shoulder?
Diallo.
And then you didn't say what the outcome of the post, her case against the post was?
It was dropped, actually.
She dropped the suit?
She dropped the suit, yeah.
Okay. Well, this is sort of a comment, and I mean, possibly a slightly critical one. I mean, I'm very attentive to speculation. I mean, I'm somebody who writes often at a speculative level. And I mean, I really try to ground my speculations in some form of evidence. So usually I'll offer a piece of evidence before I go on to speculative edit. So there are 2 points in your paper, I mean, since you asked for feedback, because you were revising it, that I found the speculations to be problematic. The first, the speculation that Diallo had consented to sex with DSK. I've heard no evidence to support that, and so the question would be, what distinguishes your, presumably feminist, or kind of classic feminist sort of speculation from the post-speculation that she was turning tricks on the side? Mm-hmm. And the second thing about, the point about DSK, perhaps you relish being the subject of the noise at the Cambridge Union. I see no, offering of some evidence to ground that speculation in. And I feel like for my own, comfort level, I need something for that speculation to be, grounded in.
Okay, so really important. Diallo, I'm not in any way, or I certainly didn't teach it this way when we talked about this case, that Diallo consented, or that, there was something that is definitive in what happened between Diallo and DSK.
I understand that, but even to say I speculate that.
Mm-hmm. But I also think that for me, I was more interested in getting students to think about, well, what happens when such a headline appears? Like, what are the various positions that actually emerge, and who's arguing from what perspective, right? So, Marcella Yakub's claim that, that this is something that there was no sexual assault, and that in fact she was doing this simply because DSK has power, is clearly one perspective. Diallo, in all of her media communication, repeated over and over again how she was completely stunned by the escalation of violence that had happened, right? So in some ways, I guess my reading of this and how I engaged with the class was to sort of leave a space of ambiguity around, both, the terms in which this engagement happened, but also how is it that the media perceived whether it was consent or it wasn't consent. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, because, I mean, if I put, to the class, what happened was not consensual. Yes, Diallo was coerced. She had a dislocated shoulder, right? She pursued with, attempting to follow this in a trial. And I think one of the things that we kind of looked at was, well, what was the speculation around the fact that Diallo left the hotel room, and the way that the media sort of described what had happened, it focused on that she acted in a really irrational way. Like she actually went to the kitchen, she started chatting with people. This is all on camera. But that's not something that a normal person who's just been assaulted would do. But that's precisely what we were questioning in the class. It's like, well, what is normal after, you've been assaulted? What is normal after you've had like a dislocated shoulder, or you're in shock, or you're not quite sure what to do, or you leave, or maybe, you know that you can't really say anything or go to the police because this is DSK, right?
So I'm going to press you a little harder on that, because those are two different levels of, thing. I mean, there's evidence on, I sort of vaguely remember this, that she'd gone to whatever it was, the break room after the thing, and then there were interpretations or speculations based on that piece of evidence. Yeah. I see no piece of evidence that, to support any speculation that she was turning tricks with him. So if you had some form of evidence, like somebody else came forward and said, she charged me, X amount for a blowjob a week before, to me that would be evidence. Right. Otherwise, I think you're being reckless.
No, I don't think there, oh no, I agree with you. I don't think there is evidence that she was selling sex on the side, but I think it's precisely sort of the way in which it was presented. This is why she sued the New York Post, right? It's precisely for that reason, because that was the claim that was made, and it also upheld, the romantic story that this was like DSK's sort of life, right? That this is what he did. He paid for sex, and that it was consensual. But definitely not. I don't think there is evidence of that, which is why, I'm kind of disappointed that that was not pursued in terms of like the legal suit wasn't pursued.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood the kind of remark you're making, because I thought you were saying we speculated in class that she was,
No, we speculated that the question of, could she have agreed to have sex with DSK at first? Perhaps. There was semen found. There was also some other.
Semen doesn't suggest consent.
No, I realize that. But there was also speculation around sort of, and this is what there were some interviews with other chambermaids around, the sort of the culture of hotels that are geared towards wealthy individuals like DSK, right? So that's all speculative. That's all morality. But not to suggest that perhaps that is going on. But that's not to sort of like impose a moral judgment on whether it was or wasn't going on. But it's the way that the sort of the media played it out.
Okay, very good. I mean, since we're running behind, let's move on. And thank Maria-Belén. Our next speaker is Kathy Gatsa, Associate Professor of Classics and Divinity at Vanderbilt University. Her first book is a very important work, The Making of Fornication, Eros, and Politics in Greek Philosophy and Early Christianity. And she's currently, in the last few years, been producing a series of articles on rape in warfare in antiquity and sense, and that will be the subject of her next book. And here we're getting a taste of her comments about how this has affected her pedagogy in teaching students even on the ancient Mediterranean, something that we would think of as being very remote history, but of course, those of us who are classicists always know just how relevant it is to the modern age.
So, thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to all of you for still being here. Kind of a little bit of a marathon, but I've learned an enormous amount from all of these talks. So it's been incredibly valuable for me. I've got a ton of notes on all kinds of things. So let me begin. As a scholar of classics and religion in the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, my presentation today on the paradox of college rape culture draws upon my temporally broad approach to historicist moral philosophy, which ranges from antiquity to modernity. In this field, my research is concerned with sexual problems of social injustice, especially sexual repression and violence, that have roots going back to ancient popular morality, show continuities over time, and still are active as problems in modernity. Heterosexual rape is one such problem of great interest in my work. And presently my main interest is in exploring lethal and enslaving martial rape on mass and ravaging warfare from antiquity to modernity. My research approach is well represented in Modernity by Michel Foucault, whose work has influenced mine, but my approach draws deeply on ancient historians who were attentive to popular morality, and on ancient moral philosophers who were attentive to the complex social history of morality from Herodotus and Thucydides and Plato and Aristotle onward. My perspective is also shaped by feminism and feminist philosophy. Let me state at the outset what I perceive to be convincing evidence that there is a real problem of rape culture on college campuses, which is not to downplay evident issues with how some university administrators are responding to the problem. First, as analyzed in recent studies such as Krakauer's Missoula and Dirk's Confronting Campus Rape, it is clear that some male college students, such as in Missoula, in Nashville, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, are getting excited by the idea of making this or that female student comatose from drugs or alcohol or both, so that one or more men can use her like a sex toy, penetrating her vaginally and anally, and also using foreign objects for this purpose. In the Vanderbilt incident, criminal charges were filed based on the video surveillance footage handed over to the Nashville Metro Police by university personnel. This case moved to 2 convictions, largely because of the video surveillance. It is sobering to imagine the uphill battle the assaulted woman would have had once she regained consciousness the next morning, if there were no video surveillance and if she brought a complaint based on bodily injuries to the university administration to resolve, be she at Vanderbilt or any other university, given the experience of female students who have faced precisely this struggle. Second, we see college rape culture in the voices, I'm not going to say how many, I have no basis for speculating, the voices of male student intransigents against respecting the sexual volition of female students. In the No Means No campaign of the mid-1990s, I saw as a passerby a pseudo-clever rejoinder on a sign taped in a male dorm room window. Scratching out the second no, the sign changed the dictum to "no" means give her another beer. This meant, or so I interpreted it at the time, ply her with more drinks until she assents, in the sense of releasing her inhibitions, thus facilitating the young woman to say yes, under the influence, even though she might regret it later. In light of incidents of drugging, however, perhaps this already meant no means make her pass out and use her. My hunch is that my first interpretation is more likely, for giving her another beer does not have the knockout impact of sedatives mixed with alcohol, which is a basic step in making a woman not able to resist being raped for an extended period of time. And now, in tandem with universities becoming more active in demanding consent, such as posting signs that say, quote, "sex without consent is sexual assault," end quote, on my home university of Vanderbilt, one prominent rejoinder to "no" means no has become more extreme, lacking the ambiguity to allow for a more charitable interpretation. This is the attested chant "no" means yes, which denies that a woman saying no can ever be validly negative in her saying of no. This is a matter not only of words but of deeds, as enacted when one or a few male students isolate a woman from her friends and overpower her, which includes pushing her head hard against the wall and or against the floor, as attested in a number of sexual assault complaints recently brought to federal attention under the student-led Title IX movement. Third, college rape culture also surfaces in the threatening responses to the movement's leaders, Annie Clark, Andrea Pino, and Sophie Karasek. They have received hate mail, death threats, and had their property vandalized. On these grounds, it is clear that there is a problem with college rape culture. In response, I think a good grassroots solution would be for students not only to end rape on campus, EROC, but to work amongst themselves to change campus culture by eroticizing consent, with creative interpersonal responses to the yes means yes policy that is gaining traction now, whether despite reservations expressed today. Right now, the policy seems a sexually specific but stilted university administrative version of the old-fashioned man asks woman, may I have this dance? And she says yes or no, and he is supposed to be Mr. Chivalrous, respecting her wishes. Yet he is the only one who gets to do the asking. Instead, the students should work together to impart some excitement to yes means yes, so that it means mutually aroused sexual relations, as in yes, oh yes, in word and body. Further, the young women and men constituting our student body should be openly encouraged to discuss what they want sexually, what is oh yes to them, be it with men or with women, and correspondingly to insist that it is passé to violently impose, and by impose I mean anti-consensual, to impose sex on another person. The ancient Greeks considered the arousal in rape to be one of a one-way licentiousness, characteristic of how free men treated slaves sexually. Thus, college rape culture would seem paradoxical from an ancient viewpoint. On the one hand, college is a moment of big pride and opportunity. A college education is oriented toward intellectual and moral betterment, toward enhancing self-worth, affirmative interactions and opportunities for male and female students alike. Nonetheless, entrenched attitudes that devalue female volition are evocative of freeborn men wanting and treating girls and young women as slaves, the opposite of the fully enfranchised voting fellow citizens that women now are, albeit only as of a little bit less than a century ago. Harriet Jacobs, who was a slave in the American South, lived through the extreme of what has historically been a norm when female sexual and other volition is customarily treated with indifference and disdain. Quote, the slave girl is reared in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. The lash and the foul talk of her master and his sons are her teachers. When she is 14 or 15, her owner or his sons or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped or starved into submission to their will. Resistance is hopeless. I was 21 years in that cage of obscene birds. I can testify from my own experience and observation that slavery makes the white fathers cruel and sensual, the sons violent and licentious, end quote. The ancients thus would find it astounding that colleges are a place where young women in a free society, a society that has supposedly transcended slavery, even though I know this is problematic given ongoing trafficking and in effect people being slaves but not recognized as such publicly. But nonetheless, in a society that has supposedly transcended slavery, and colleges would be a place where you think that this would at least be sort of accomplished, are at risk of being treated as the equivalent of sexually violable slaves by some of their male peers. According to Cicero, for instance, it is a cosmic injustice for a freeborn Roman woman to be raped. Quote, even if there was no written law against rape at Rome in the time of Tarquin, we cannot say on that account that he did not violate that eternal law by raping Lucretia, the daughter of Trichopitinus. College popular morality would do well, society as a whole would do well, to reactivate the idea that rape is an affront to human freedom. My suggestion that college students should lend an erotic charge to the Yes Means Yes campaign stands a better prospect of succeeding if higher standards of reflective popular morality are encouraged early on in college. Here, we as professors can play a contributing role in using the topic of sexuality as one way to affirm to our students the Socratic principle that the unexamined life is not worth living. The teaching goes rather like this in my classrooms, so now feel free to imagine that you are hearing me speaking to my students. First, unlike a fair amount of advanced ethical theorizing presented by specialist moral philosophers such as Kant, Mill, and Rawls, Popular morality concerns the beliefs, values, and customs that actually hit us where we live from birth. Some children of popular of philosophers might get Kant, Mill, and Rawls early on, but I'd say many of us do not, at least to the best of my knowledge. Okay, so the beliefs, values, and customs that actually hit us where we live from birth are distinct. So these beliefs and customs are steeped in bodily and verbal languages, and they both shape and are shaped by the people in media who have a hand in delivering our nurture and education to us, and also by our creative responses to both. We're not just simply receptors. In my experience growing up, topics such as moral philosophy and the overall art of thinking reflectively about our actions, cultivating empathy and respect for others, and trying not to hurt others and taking responsibility when we do, are not overtly taught as a universal norm in our nurture and education. The extent to which we pick up on any of the above depends on the luck of the draw, such as who our parents, teachers, siblings, and friends are, and for many, where there is a kind of religious aspect to their upbringing that has contained some of a moral tenor, such as the Christian dictum, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, okay, which is actually pretty close to Kant's golden rule. Okay, so this hit or miss is unfortunate, as seen in college campuses in the occurrence of rape and other harmful behaviors, such as racist graffiti, that show a hurtful lack of empathy, respect, and a failure of responsible behavior. So any eroticizing of consent needs rational moral maturity as its broader framework. Second, we need this moral reflection for historical reasons. Historically and still today, much about popular morality can strongly pressure us to conform, but proves immoral upon deeper reflection and is worth resisting, such as white supremacy and heterosexual rape. To exercise this reflection is difficult because the beliefs and practices that inform these immoralities have a reinforcing quality that can make those who are raised under them think they are right and normal. For an example of white supremacy gendered feminine, consider this experience of slavery as perpetuated in the child rearing of masters and slaves in the early 19th century, as recollected by Mary Prince, a slave of African descent in the Caribbean West Indies. Acquired as an infant along with her mother in an estate sale, Mary Prince was bought for and given to little Miss Betsy Williams by her grandfather when Miss Betsy was still a very young girl, but Mary was an infant. Okay, learning by imitating her mother, she treated Mary as her personal pet slave. Quote, "When I was an infant, old Mr. Myers died, and there was a division of slaves and other property among the family. I was bought along with my mother by old Captain Darrell and given to his grandchild, little Miss Betsy Williams. Mrs. Williams was a kind-hearted, good woman, and she treated all her slaves well. She had only one daughter, Miss Betsy, for whom I was purchased and who was about my age. I was made quite a pet of by Miss Betsy and loved her very much. She used to lead me around by the hand and call me her little nigger," end quote. In the popular morality surrounding Miss Betsy, Miss Betsy clearly received signals from her mother, grandfather, and even from Mary as a young child that she was a good girl and female master in training to be treating Mary as her N-word pet. As Mary herself says, "I loved her very much." Yet much was wrong in that Williams household. Number one, the total disregard for the volition of the people dehumanized as slaves. Third, unlike law codes, popular morality is not codified for easy access to be read, consulted, and discussed. Rather, norms are what the Greeks called unwritten laws. Like currents of air or eddies in a river, they swirl around us, are in us, and come from us, going out to others, such as the music we listen to and the songs we sing. This makes the examine life an ongoing effort, such as asking yourself, do you really want to shop these brands or pursue that high-paying job, and if so, why? Similarly, to speak from my own experience, some of the strongest pressures came from my female and male same-age friends, that is my peers, in shaping my sexual behavior. In retrospect, the pressure I felt then to emulate their sexual behavior seems one of the dumbest ideas I ever labored under. After all, what did they know, any more than I did, about the arts of mutually arousing and creative erotic love? Not much beyond going steady and imitating our parents. But for all the proto-marital, like definitely sort of compulsory heterosexual kind of pressures I experienced in my teens, none to my recollection included male peers thrilling to the idea and being adamant about the idea that women's sexual volition does not matter and that the need to respect it is there to be scorned. So when you encounter this swirl of popular morality, whatever its origins, think about this, because it seems to be a persistence of that kind of one-way licentiousness that is contrary to mutual erotic joy. And it's worth pushing back. And it's worthwhile to support a campus and a broader societal culture that thrills to yes in mutually aroused sexual agency, with the women being active players and having their volition unconditionally respected as full persons and citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, I think we may have time for just one question, and then we can continue the conversation during the coffee break. Anything for Kathy right now? Yes, Laura.
I want to hear more about how you see in your study of the Greek texts and these ancient philosophical texts, the idea that there is one kind of human nature and how this pervades the rhetoric of thinking about the ideal school or the ideal city, because in my studies I've seen that, over time there's no one way to conceive of human nature. And some people see it as something that needs to be constructed, some people see it as something that needs to be discovered. So, how do we negotiate different ideas about nature, different regimes, different traditions about the body that all coexist in the 21st century? And how do we reconcile that at a cosmopolitan university? Thanks.
The biggest question in the world. What I would say, we should talk further afterwards, but the modernity is in many ways at odds with antiquity. Because with, the Stoics have very much the sense that human beings have a nature that can be read from actual sort of animal examples and from actually looking at the processes of nature, so that we actually have that you can, through an interpretation of nature, you actually have a sense of a real kind of providentially given human nature. And much of that now has radically gone by the wayside under ideas of that our nature is socially constructed, and that any kind of like embedded naturalness is actually a kind of way of in a sense appealing to kind of unexamined traditions and keeping them in place. So I don't see an easy reconciliation, but especially because it's in many ways it's not as the kind of work I'm doing where there are connections between antiquity and modernity. I see meaningful continuities, but in the case of ideas about nature and human nature relative to nature, there's a big break.
One thing that I think that studying the classical world can do is to make you examine that no same people in the 21st century is on the same page about what human nature is. So I think that it's a very valuable exercise. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Well, let's congratulate Kathy once again.